Hey everybody, welcome back to the HATM podcast. I'm your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week for the last 6 years, we've been bringing to you movies and the histories behind them. And this week, we're talking about 2002's Minority Report. And I wanted to bring in for you a scholar of policing so we could talk about this Tom Cruise movie. So I brought in for you Matthew Guariglia. He is the author of a brand new book from Duke University Press called Police in the Empire City, Race and the Origins of Modern Policing in New York. And we're going to talk not only about this movie, but also about the histories behind it. We're going to talk specifically about Matthew's work, about how policing in New York changes over time in the early 20th century, and how those changes affect policing throughout the United States and all the way up until now, and how that actually becomes visible on screen when we watch Minority Report. So I think you're going to dig this conversation. I really enjoyed going back and watching Minority Report. I hadn't seen it in a long time, and really dug having this conversation with Matthew, who's a new friend of mine. I hope that you really dig this conversation. So sit back and relax, because Minority Report is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Matt Guariglia, shit, let's try it again. But I got cocky. I was like, this was like Matt Guariglia. Oh, I got it right that time. So, hey, Matt, how are you?
Good. How you doing, Jason?
I'm fumbling through phonics right now, man. That's what I'm doing. It's just like I'm trying to, I dated an Italian woman, a woman of Italian ancestry for the longest time. And she had much less vowels than yours. So it was easier. And then I thought maybe I could do this, but apparently I can't. So welcome to the pod, dude. I'm so excited you're here.
Yeah. I'm very happy to be here.
So you just wrote this book, and I want to get into this. I want to talk about Minority Report today because we're trying to figure out like what movie to do. And I was like hitting you with some options early on. I want to get into why we did Minority Report and all stuff. I went back and I hadn't watched this movie in a while.
It's a Spielberg. I think people forget it is a Spielberg. It's in the canon.
It's a Spielberg. It's like low key. It's like one of those low key Spielberg films because you think Spielberg, you think Jaws, Jurassic Park, Raiders, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got this movie, this is related. Is it not to Blade Runner? Isn't this a Philip K. Dick adaptation as well?
It is. It is Philip K. Dick. It is a short story. It's not even like a novella. It's a short story. Because I went back to the short story before this, and it is like maybe 30 pages max. It is very short.
Really? Okay. I knew it was I knew it was a Dick movie, but I didn't know. Now we're just gonna go ahead and get like all the people. Let's say before we jump into Minority Report and talk about your book, how about we introduce you and talk to us about who you are and like your work and kind of go from there. How's that?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Matthew Guariglia. I have a PhD in history where my work focused on history of race and ethnicity, policing, and state power more generally. As the end of this book, the final chapter of this book suggests, since then, my work has gone more into the history of technology, to information technology, to surveillance studies, which bridges to my day job, which is I'm a senior policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a civil liberties nonprofit organization that focuses on making sure that technology helps aid liberation and does not curtail it. So my job there is to study and to advocate on behalf of people against surveillance, against government surveillance, be it the NSA, big national security federal surveillance, or what kind of technology your local law enforcement use, or increasingly, and I think this is a good thing to get to with Minority Report, the revolving door between consumer surveillance and what companies collect about you and how that winds its way into the hands of police. And so I am, by training, a historian of the late 19th, early 20th century who is somehow Harold Hill, Music Man, conned my way into a job in contemporary technology policy, and am now suddenly, many years in, starting to see how it all kind of is the synthesis of all that work, to see how it kind of really actually lines up, and whether or not I'm talking about 1904 or 2024 or even, as Minority Report suggests, the future. I'm kind of always talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. When you and I started talking, we were like, "Hey, let's do a movie," and I was like, "Okay, cool." No shortage of films about police officers. I was like, "Okay, cool. We'll line up New York." I think I'd suggested Serpico to you before I'd kind of read through your book, and this turned out to be way more relevant to your work than I was even expecting, because you're like Minority Report, and I was like, okay, let's do it. Like I'll watch that, right? And people like this movie. It's also terrifying in some ways. Going back to watch this film reflects a lot of the fears I think a lot of people feel now about, quote unquote, maybe the surveillance state or police state or things like that, which I want to get into. But I want to backtrack just a little bit. Before we start talking about the future, I want to talk about the past and your past. We were just talking before we started recording. You're from New York originally, correct?
Yeah, I was born in New York, was in New York till I was 4 or 5, and then grew up in Connecticut.
All right, so does that make you a Yankees, Mets guy? Like, is there a line, or how does this work for you?
I'm a Yankees person. My dad is from Queens, which should make him a Mets person. I think he was growing up. The Miracle Mets, all of that. But he is a rare Jets-Yankees fan. And I don't really follow football, don't really follow the NFL, but have very much inherited being a Yankees fan and grew up going to games quite regularly.
Yeah, there's like a line there, right? Like, I was talking to my friend Liz about this, who is a Yankees and Jets fan. I'm like, that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to be Yankees, Giants, Rangers, or Jets, Mets, Islanders. Isn't that like how it goes in New York, like on the sports team? And I don't even know about the NBA.
And now Knicks and Nets have joined that division as well.
Okay, so I'm assuming that Knicks go along with the Yankees and the Nets go along with the Mets. Is that right?
Yes, my understanding. Yeah, I've only been to one Knicks game and one Nets game in my entire life, but have been to dozens and dozens and dozens of Yankees games over the years. So that's where my true allegiance lies.
Well, you're talking to like the one kid. Like I grew up in the South, right? I'm from Kentucky and Louisiana, and I grew up as a Yankees fan. And people are like, "Oh, you're a Kentucky basketball and a Yankees fan." I'm like, well, I grew up in the 80s and we sucked. So there's that. Like, Don Mattingly never got a World Series. He never even got to go. He got close in 94 and then there was a strike. And then he retired, I think it was. 94, 95, whatever it was. And it was my T-ball team when I was in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. Louisiana, of course, home to a great baseball tradition, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, I will do this. This will be my guys. And I get so much shit over it. And I'm like, do I have to justify that? Like, first of all, we haven't been good in a while, because the Yankees have like a standard. So yeah, I was curious to hear. Looking at your work, I was like, this guy's gonna have thoughts on baseball. It's like an identity thing, even if you don't follow it in the city. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is very entwined with the fabric of the city in a way that, I'm sure every city claims this about their baseball teams, but the Yankees, I mean, it goes back so far. I mean, 1903, I think, is the start of the Yankees. That's a pretty early founding for a baseball team.
Yeah, and really like the basic idea of greatness. Like, so we've got a podcast coming up, and it may have aired by the time people hear this, but on Glory, and I had 4 amazing scholars on there, and people are asking me, well, what was it like to record the podcast? I'm like, it was like playing catch with the 27 Yankees. It's like,
Yeah.
That's like something that is good. It's like, and I'm like, Gehrig is my favorite baseball player of all time. So, that's my dude, because I have a lot in common being from Kentucky. And I think Gehrig was he from Brooklyn? I can't recall where. That's not important. From New York. So if you're from Kentucky like me, New York is this place that you've never been. So it's this magical place full of buildings and schools and things like that, electricity and things like that my people don't really have. So, all right, let's just jump in here. I have like so many questions for you. We talked a little bit about this. So was this like a definite thing when I came to you, I was like, why Minority Report itself? Like, were there other thoughts you had as far as thinking about your work as far as film goes, or why specifically this one particularly.
Yeah, Minority Report, because I think in this book, one thing I really wanted to capture was that there were all these people who really thought, not just in policing, but in science, in medicine, in education, in government, who really thought the turn of the 20th century was like a new era of experimentation. That it was an era in which anything could happen. That science and technology, all of these things were revolutionizing new ways of organizing society, new economic systems. That really no one knew what America was going to look like 50 years from 1903. And in policing in particular, there's this real moment of experimentation. There's this real moment of trying to imbue a system that had been traditionally, a bunch of wool-clad kind of pugilists who got the job because they could pacify by force, and try to turn them into something which was read as scientific. That was aided by modern technologies, that were aided by classroom training, that was cutting edge, that was data driven, so to speak, and I really thought about specifically in the book the major problem of about 40 or 50 years of policing around the turn of the 20th century of how to police a city that is increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multilingual. How to solve that problem, and it relied on a lot of experimentation, a lot of importing tactics and technologies from all over the world. It relied on cops to talk to academic professors and to talk to medical doctors, and it was this real moment of experimentation where policing and crime was a laboratory for what the future would look like. And it was given rise by this kind of Sherlock Holmes archetype of, cops aren't just fighters with batons and revolvers. They can be scientists and they can be chemists. And so to me, Minority Report is really the kind of end result of a stream of thinking about policing and about crime that has its origins in the book that I write in the late 19th and early 20th century, of thinking about how can we use science and technology to solve crime once and for all. That crime, like a medical condition, is something that can be treated. It's something that we can find solutions to. Who's going to be the first one to crack how to do it? And there are all these different competing theories. There's criminal anthropology. There's eugenics. There's, the New York City Police Department hires a dozen statisticians, which, to me becomes the origins of like algorithmic predictive policing. And so I really see Minority Report as the kind of end result, the future envisioning of the exact type of thinking that all these people were doing in the Gilded Age and Progressive era.
Yeah, it's actually, when you spell it out that way, it's weird, because the big idea with this film, right, is this idea of the precogs, that they'll figure out these murders before they actually happen. They'll end crime. There's another film, think about, like, in terms of this, like Demolition Man, where they've largely ended crime as a result of their policing activities as well. And I'd never really thought about that in terms of like, so. And I guess, you're absolutely right as far as these ideas you were talking about. These ideas of eugenics and so forth. Like, we're going to end crime. I can think about like World War I. We've ended war. We're all done with war now. And so it turns out that turns out not to be the case. All right. I've got so many questions for you in regards to this. Can we talk a little bit before we jump into the movie about where policing is, say, in 1903? And how and where that change is going from. I'm thinking about Theodore Roosevelt, his time as chief of police in New York. What's this big change? What's pushing? Is it science that's driving this? I mean, why? What's going on here?
Yeah, policing is in a real transition moment, right in this period between about 1897 and the early years of the 20th century, because you've done away with a lot of the political patronage and the entrenched spoil system associated with Tammany Hall, although Tammany Hall is not quite done yet by 1903. So you've, under like Roosevelt, who was a big civil service guy, he was a big, American meritocracy person. There's this transition happens where in the 19th century, how a person becomes a police officer is your alderman, your local elected official, can appoint people to the police force. And they would do this in exchange for votes. And so how early on Irish people became such a large share of the New York City Police Department is because they were a voting bloc that the Democratic Party was eager to tap into. And so they were able to exchange these, frankly, at the time, kind of middle class, good, stable, salaried jobs in exchange for votes of people and their neighbors and their kinship networks for appointments to the police department. Theodore Roosevelt, when he becomes the president of the Board of Commissioners, does away with this. And now it's an exam. Now it's a test. And so now there is a way to weed out the exact type of people who could be appointed earlier, which were immigrants, German Irish immigrants, people who would get the appointments in exchange for votes. Now they could tweak the exam so that the people who were most qualified to get in were white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, American-born men.
Is this a movement because just generally the idea is like, let's just get the best possible people, the idea of taking the test, or is this a way to enforce like racial order, say in New York City by doing this? Like what's the driving force behind making sure that it's WASPs who are doing the policing?
It's both, because the two are so entwined. There's this evolving notion that I talk about in the book of what a good police officer is. And the politicians and the commissioners and the people high up, the reformers high up in the police department, have an evolving notion of what makes a good police officer. And so in the 19th century, Irish people are seen as, predisposed to violence. They're predisposed to corruption and graft and bribery and brutality and all of these things. And yet, because policing is so predicated on the ability of these men to do violence on behalf of the state, on behalf of a capitalist system, on behalf of a white supremacist system, the place of Irish people in the police force is a complicated one. Because on the one hand, they are seen as like biologically predisposed to everything that's wrong with policing. But on the other hand, they find that ability to do violence so essential. And so the reforms are to clean up what they see as, 60 years essentially of Tammany mismanagement of the New York City Police Department, which has built an incredibly corrupt police department that and corrupt here, you can read Irish. I mean, an incredibly Irish police force, an incredibly corrupt police force, an incredibly brutal police force. And so instituting a civil service roster, the Luxow Committee in 1895 is this big state-run New York investigation into corruption and brutality in the NYPD. They root out a lot of the worst offenders, the most notoriously corrupt police, and they fire them. And they supposedly start trying to clean up the NYPD. But of course, the other thing that I try to really get to in the book is that there is an entrenched culture that is so hard to get rid of. And whether this be reform, this be about brutality, it'd be about corruption, it'd be about changing the culture in the NYPD, top-down mandates very rarely make an impact for the rank and file. And so even as, Theodore Roosevelt and these kind of Republican good government reformers try to clean up the NYPD, they run into a lot of hurdles in trying to actually change the culture and the nature of the department.
I'm kind of wondering, Matt, if the city itself is changing as well to turn towards. I have always, in my mind's eye, considered New York City as this place of remarkable change because of the influx of immigrants and power dynamics of New York. what's going on, say, in New York City in, say, 1897 to 1903, this early part of the 20th century? Is the city itself changing? Are the demographics changing? Or is it just growing? What's going on, and how are the police responding to it?
This is the question that really started the book. This is the question that the first question is you look at the demographics of New York City that you see from 1880 to about 1920. The city goes from, I think, something like 80% native English speaking to around 40% native English speaking, and just the span of 40 years. There is a huge shift demographically, and this includes also the beginning of the Great Migration of people, of African Americans moving north from the South, as in the early years of Jim Crow segregation and kind of the high point of American lynching, people moving up north to New York City. And so the demographics of the city are shifting. And so you have the situation unfolding where, after these big reforms, the NYPD, where all of these reformers have built a department to kind of weed out what they see as kind of lower quality immigrant police officers and prioritize hiring American-born Protestants to the police force. And suddenly you have a department that is incredibly ill-equipped to handle a massive influx of people. And there are all this hand-wringing, a tremendous amount of not just hand-wringing, but panic over how on earth is the city going to learn how to subordinate so many different types of people in such a multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multilingual city. And this kind of leads to this moment of experimentation where the department is eager to pull on solutions from anywhere they can get their hands on, including overseas, including the U.S. empire, including industry, including, kind of Taylorization and Fordism from industry. And so you have this real moment where the police are looking at these demographic changes and realizing that they have a lot of work and intellectual work to do to figure out what policing is going to look like in this new century.
One of the things I always used to love when I was teaching was pulling up primary sources where people were constantly, where you have a lot of white residents hand-wringing over the changing demographics of a city and things like that. And it sounds certainly like that's what's going on in New York at the turn of the 20th century. We see this right now in contemporary politics right now. I can't, with the border and all these things, this is a revolving plot line in the story of American history, right? Is New York a dangerous place at the turn of the 20th century? What's that like? What's the lived experience for boy, it's hard to say an average New Yorker, right? For an average anyone, but what's the city like?
I think historians have concluded that early 20th century New York was much more dangerous per se than modern New York. But it depends on who you are. It depends on where you are. I mean, there are articles that I've seen about what to do with police randomly arresting people for no reason. Like huge front page headlines of newspapers, like what to do if you've been arrested for no reason. And the articles say basically, we have no way of stopping police from arresting people for no reason if they feel like it. They have so much discretion on the street. Every type of reform we've done to curb police brutality, to curb unwarranted arrests has done nothing. So what to do? So, if you were especially a Black New Yorker and you were just, claiming your access to public amenities, to the street, to the sidewalk, you were vulnerable to violence, not just from police, but from white residents of the city as well. And so, the city was a dangerous place, but not just from crime per se, but from from trolley cars. I mean, the Brooklyn Dodgers got their name from the trolley Dodgers because so many people were getting hit by trolleys in the middle of the street. So New York in general was a more dangerous place, but also it depended on who you were and where you were as to what those threats looked like.
I want to ask you about eugenics because so much of this film is based around these ideas of the precogs who are just these three horribly treated human beings. I feel so awful for them when I watch this film. And I'm kind of wondering what if you can kind of maybe, for those people who are listening who aren't familiar with what the eugenics movement was at the turn of the 20th century, kind of jump into a little bit about like what the scientific answer to crime was in the 20th century, and then maybe what the imagined scientific answer to crime is in this film. Kind of talk a little bit about the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about Minority Report with the history of eugenics is incredibly interesting because eugenics was this intellectual, medical, academic, and legal discipline in the early 20th century, which found that the body of the population in general is like the body of a person, and you have to remove the parts which make it sick, which make it weaker, in order to improve society as a whole. And so this involved really thinking about who should be excluded from the population physically, like who should be deported, who should be removed from the country, but also who had the right to procreate, who had the right to have children, and to continue to contribute their bloodline, their family, their kinship networks into the kind of general civic body of the nation. And so it involved a lot of sterilization of people with disabilities, of people who harbored, same-sex desires, of people of certain racial and ethnic identities. And it was this, legally legitimized and medical discipline legitimized practice and field of study, which really, when it comes to crime, thought about people were biologically predisposed to crime. Not just because of who your parents were, if they were arrested for crimes, but also down to your race or ethnicity. There was a real understanding that some people, either based on their race or ethnicity, based on their upbringing, their socioeconomic status, based on their factors contributing to their health, their cleanliness, their living conditions, that some people were just biologically predisposed to crime. And it's interesting to think about this in relation to Minority Report, in which the idea of free will is brought up readily, where if the precogs have predicted somebody is going to commit a crime, and they're arrested for it before they even commit it, how certain are they that was going to happen? And this is very similar to thinking about eugenics, thinking about a young person who is from a working class family of immigrants who, many generations of which might have had run-ins with the criminal justice system, and them being harassed and expected by law enforcement, by the state, to eventually run afoul of the law, no matter, who they are or what their free will has to do with it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem, I mean, the whole idea, because it seems to me like what's driving these ideas of who is and who is not a criminal is being driven by largely, am I wrong here, Matt, the idea of white Protestant Christians who are kind of making these decisions. And then you're talking about this idea that, like, okay, groups of minorities who are seen to be troublemakers, and then you've got police who are already targeting them, which kind of creates this cycle.
There's a real feedback loop. Absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
Cesare Lombroso, this academic and physician in Italy in the late 19th century, who's the kind of the founder and the main thinker behind this field of criminal anthropology, really kind of pioneered this idea that certain ethnic groups were prone toward certain types of criminality. And not only that, but that criminality could be predicted on a person's body, that a brow shaped like this meant that person was more likely to commit a crime than somebody whose brow was shaped like this. And the way he founded this was he went into prisons and he studied the faces of hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. And he said, well, what are the things they have in common? But of course, we see how the feedback loop is, because if the people if the police are harassing only certain types of people and they're arresting them, and those are the people that fill in the jails, then any scientific study founded on that body of that database of people, for lack of a better word, would necessarily provide conclusions that mean that type of people are biologically predisposed to crime.
I was watching in this film for ideas behind these ideas between ethnicity, things like that, and I didn't necessarily see it. I was kind of watching to see representations in this movie. I was kind of hoping you might be able to jump into that, because I was like, okay, Cruz is obviously our protagonist here, Caucasian male. Is this a diverse department? Are the departments in New York, are the police departments diverse themselves as well, or are they still largely white? Like, how do these two things kind of reflect?
I mean, for the movie taking place in D.C., it's an incredibly white film, which I think maybe to sidestep some of these exact questions, but they might have been hoping to avoid that conversation. But the NYPD is rapidly diversifying in the early 20th century, at least along ethnic lines, in part out of ethnicity or out of necessity. It's not in the spirit of goodwill. It's not in the spirit of increasing diversity for diversity's sake. The department is desperate to have detectives and officers who could go into immigrant neighborhoods and speak the same language as them, to solve crimes, to talk to witnesses, to try to weed out who the quote unquote troublemakers were. And so it was very much based on necessity. And this is interesting because when it comes to the first appointment of black officers to the NYPD, it happens at least a decade, if not more, than the first, Jewish, Italian, even Chinese officers. And that took a tremendous amount of activism on the part of the black community in New York to get that appointment. And in part because the NYPD didn't see it as being such a necessity, as like they really needed a Chinese officer, they really needed Italian officers. But in comparison, black New Yorkers seemed more familiar. They seemed more manageable to a white state.
I wonder if that's because of the language issue.
It's definitely because of the language, because of the culture. Yeah.
And I'm thinking now that you bring up these ideas of, the racial profiling and racial groups within the police department, were black officers serving in distinctly black units within the police department? How does that work?
Yes, not black units. No, there were so in the book I talk about the formation of things like the German squad and the Italian squad, which were centralized squads in which they recruited people based on their language skills and deployed them not just to one ethnic neighborhood, but to wherever a crime was that happened to the city that involved somebody of their ethnic group. They would deploy these decentralized people to that neighborhood. There was no, black squad in the way there was an Italian squad. The first officer, the first black officer, Samuel Battle, was sent to San Juan Hill, which at the time was the biggest black neighborhood in New York, and then was eventually moved to Harlem, just as that was becoming the most dense black neighborhood in the city. And even though he didn't have a squad per se, he described himself through the lens of these immigrant police officers, where he often said, I feel like the NYPD needs me more than I need them because I'm in a neighborhood of all black residents and all of my coworkers are white, so they really need me. Which is a language of necessity that you never see the NYPD use when they're talking about black neighborhoods, but they certainly use when they're talking about, say, Chinatown.
We see both men and women in the police force in Minority Report. What's the gender divisions in the police in the early 20th century? Is this a man's line of work? Are women doing this work at all? What do the archives tell you there when you were looking around at that?
You see reformers desperately asking for women police, in part because of the way patrolmen treat women on the street, often with a lot of discretion, a lot of arrest for no reason, especially black women, a lot of just being out on the street, being read by police as a threat to public order, being arrested for soliciting prostitution, and so there's a lot of fear about what an out of control police force will do to women in the city. And so there's a push from reformers, especially the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to have more female police officers because they think they'll handle women in a more kind of benign way, which is honestly similar to the arguments that activists are making for why there should be black officers, that black officers will treat black pedestrians in a nicer fashion than white officers. But no, there aren't quite yet a lot of female officers. That's kind of going to be a thing that starts to come into play in the 1920s, 30s, and especially 40s. And I definitely recommend Emily Brooks's new book, Gotham's War Within a War, when it comes to talking about. She really chronicles the rise of female police officers in New York in a really great way.
I want to ask you this. This comes up in your book. What's the Italian problem?
Yeah, the Italian problem is this particular panic about crime committed by Italians, not just in New York, but it's actually kind of a global problem with mass migration, this big diaspora of Italians to, New York, all over the industrialized Northeast, New Orleans, parts of the South, but also Buenos Aires, also different cities in Latin America. There's this fear of Italian crime that is international, and it's kind of a hybrid combination of organized crime, the early mafia, but also the connection between Italian immigrants and radical anarchism. And especially kind of propaganda of the deed style assassinations of politicians, police chiefs, industrialists, heads of state all over Europe and the Western Hemisphere, that kind of all get mushed up and entwined in the fears of New Yorkers. And there's this real panic, especially around 1903, 1904, about what on earth is this police department, which only has maybe less than 10 Italian-speaking officers. What are they really going to do about this crime panic?
I'm wondering how World War I changes all of this, because it seems to be we're moving in. We started in the early 20th century, and then this war happens. Wars in American history tend to be these huge motivators of change. What happens with the war? Does the war affect policing in New York during the war, after the war? Do the perceptions of crime or race or ethnicity change as a result of it? What happens in the relationships between the police and the public they serve?
Yeah, I mean, World War I, I think, plays an important role in militarizing the police. And I'm not saying at all, it's not the beginning of where police militarization starts. I mean, I think a lot of people have argued, really amazingly, that the revolving door between police and empire, going back to the colonization of the western half of that hemisphere, and then especially with the War of 1898. Militarization had been happening all along. In fact, policing itself as an institution, we can trace it back to England's colonization of Ireland and the first police departments there. But I think World War I played an important stage in militarizing the police, in part because there's this idea of preparedness, that the New York City Police Department is in many ways the first line of defense should the United States be invaded. And so there's this real emphasis on drilling the troops, on discipline, on martial discipline, which has as much to do with the bodies of the men and the race and ethnicity and gender of the men, as it does with khaki uniforms and rifles. It's about creating a homogenous police force, like soldiers, that are well disciplined and interchangeable. They have to be universally gifted, which is in many ways antithetical to the type of policing that the NYPD had championed just 10 years earlier, when they're trying to infiltrate Chinese neighborhoods and Russian neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods, where they're relying on men to bring their own kind of innate understanding and their innate language skills from their daily lives into these neighborhoods. And that's what makes them useful to the department. By World War I, they're really trying to change, they're trying to drill that out of people. They're really trying to make a police force that is universally able to police any neighborhood, no matter where they go into. And this involves physical training. It also involves classroom training. It also involves teaching people, the Italian language by sending them to night classes at Columbia. It involves, instituting NYPD libraries so that they could read about things like eugenics and criminal anthropology. So it's about training and drilling these people so that they're interchangeable, they can be universally used, and they don't have any particular skills which they make them particularly useful in one neighborhood.
All right, I want to jump to Minority Report here for a second, and talk a little bit about. We talked about earlier. This film's set in D.C., and I'm kind of wondering if New York does New York serve as like this testing ground for I don't want to say modern because we're 100-something years, but for the moment, does it serve as a test ground? Does New York have an effect on these other large metro areas? What's the New York police diaspora out of all of this? What happens in other cities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can definitely follow NYPD tactics as they move around the country, and it's not just that like, oh wow, San Francisco is using fingerprinting, and so is New York. It's that after the implementation of the Italian squad in New York to police New York's Italian neighborhoods, the leader of that squad is a man named Joseph Petrosino. And whenever other cities in the U.S. start to feel that Italian crime panic and they start to worry about what they're going to do about it, they recruit people who they call the Joseph Petrosino of Philadelphia, the Joseph Petrosino of Chicago, of New Orleans, of Dayton, Ohio. And so you can follow the NYPD's development of this kind of ethnic squad style of policing as it moves to other cities, because they are literally referring to them by the name of this one Italian detective in New York, 3,000 miles away.
This is absolutely fascinating to me. Like, I love the idea of like this. I never even thought about the evolution of crime fighting or the way that the way that this might move around. So the idea that they're all referring to say this one are these celebrities in their time period or only in their world? Do people know about them?
They are celebrity. I mean, in the same way you can pick up. I know I've picked up newspapers from Kansas City and seen articles about detectives in New York. Yes, they're absolutely celebrities, which brings a lot of attention. I mean, it eventually leads to the assassination of a lot of them, including Joseph Petrosino, who was assassinated in Italy, and is so famous.
The fuck out of
and
really?
is so famous that they bring him back, his coffin back, and it's a full parade, and there's a big funeral that's filmed and shown in theaters in Italy. They show his funeral in early movie theaters in 1909 because that's how. I found in the archives comic books about him, like early illustrated adventures of the quote unquote Sherlock Holmes of Italy, which is about Joseph Petrosino. So they're famous, very much so, but also that leads to the end of their utility, because they're all so well known, they can't really infiltrate the saloons or the restaurants that they have to anymore. And I think at its high point in New York, the Italian squad has around 100 members. When you consider there are I think like over 100,000, maybe probably a lot more than that, Italians in New York City by the time. Those 100 guys all get pretty well known. You can spot them, as they walk down the street.
They're not going undercover at that point in time.
Yeah, and in fact, part of why the Italian squad is eventually phased out is one, Theodore Bingham, the commissioner who starts phasing it out, is incredibly xenophobic. He is like a real advocate of restricting immigration. That all the crime in New York is the cause of immigrant men. I think he says at one point that like 80% of all the crime in New York is caused by Jewish men in the city. So there's he's incredibly xenophobic. So you could see why he would probably be against a style of policing that really valued and trusted the expertise of immigrant men. But also he phases that out to focus on a much smaller squad of just undercover officers. And part of what they have to do is immigration work. The reason why Joseph Petrosino is in Italy when he's assassinated is because he goes to Italy with a list of people that New York City would like to deport. And if he can find, after the 1903 immigration restrictions, if he can find evidence that those people had committed crimes back in Italy, New York can begin deportation proceedings. And so he goes with a list of Italian troublemakers to Italy and hopes that he can find police reports from them in Sicily. And it's there that he's assassinated.
I don't want to ruin the book, but I have to know, like, what happens? Is the mafia? I mean, now I'm just gonna go full on Godfather here. I'm like, I'm thinking Sicily, and I'm thinking of all this kind of stuff, and like we could do the Godfather if you want sometime. But like, what happens to this guy? Like, was this a planned assassination, or is this just a revenge thing? What's happening with this dude?
You know, people have really kind of hemmed and hawed over this. It's really hard to know what happened. I mean, Joseph Petrosino records in his diaries while he's in Italy that he's already run into a bunch of people who knew him from New York. Because, of course, immigration is not a one-way street. You know, Italians are going back to Italy all the time. And so he runs into people in Sicily who know him from New York. He supposedly traveled undercover, but apparently he was picking up mail at the front desk of his hotel under his own name. So, and even I've been in the U.S. consul in southern Italy was very involved in this entire procedure, and he says that the attempts to be undercover were kind of half-assed. He's unsure as to where or how he got, his identity was revealed. They're unclear as to who did it, but he is assassinated in Sicily. There was never really an arrest for who did it. And I think as recently as like 2005 or so, like the New York Daily News is talking about like, oh, some old man confessed to his grandson that he did it. There are always kind of rumors about who did it. There's one in the 1920s. There's one mass arrest of a counterfeiting ring. There's this kind of organized crime gambit in which they abduct people with printing experience from Italy, and they take them to cabins in upstate New York, and they say, like, here's a printing press, we're going to print fake money now, and once we've hit a certain amount of money, we'll let you go. And there's this one abducted printer who's involved in this case to kind of roll up all of these counterfeiters, and he claims that in this cabin in upstate New York, they bragged about the fact that they were the ones who killed Joseph Petrosino. So, there's never any really concrete proof of who did it. There's a lot of rumor. There's a lot of speculation, but it's one of those really kind of interesting stories. And I think recently Leonardo DiCaprio bought the rights to make a movie in which he hopes to play Joseph Petrosino, which would be interesting.
Like, in fact, we should be producing that film. I'll have my people reach out to Leo, be like, hey, Jason and Matt want to make sure you're doing this right.
I'm happy to be a consultant on that.
I'm listening to you tell the story. I'm totally entrenched. I am no longer even thinking about Minority Report at this point in time, which I think is the movie we agreed to talk about. But all I really want to talk about is like the Italian diaspora into New York at this point in time, because this is fascinating to me. And I can only imagine like you being in the archive. And this is the cool part for me, being a historian, is like chasing down these stories that just kind of pop up. When you were doing your work, this came out of your dissertation and then turned into your book, correct?
Yeah.
Were all the archives in New York? Did you have to go to Italy? Like where are you pulling these stories from as you were doing this work? Because this is fascinating to me.
No, I wish I could have gone to Italy. I did not have a lot of like research funds, because I mean that was one of the things that surprised me, is the book became very international in a way that I did not anticipate it happening. And so a lot of the archives were in New York. The NYPD does not have an archive. In 1921, they took all of their existing papers and sold it to a pulp mill in New Jersey. So the NYPD does not really have any archive pre-1921. And as it is, they don't have an archive that you can just go visit. So a lot of it is like digging through the municipal archive and like seeing where the NYPD interacted with the mayor's office, the parks department, all the places they touched. So a lot of it was in New York, the New York Public Library. People who left their papers to universities. That U.S. consul to Italy that I talked about, his papers were all at Yale. I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress. And part of the reason why I focused a lot about the intellectual history of policing here is because the politicians, the higher up people, the commissioners, the inspectors of the police, a lot of them became very notable people. They went in and out of the military, and so they had huge papers that they left to all these institutions that I could track down.
All right, I want to put on your fanboy hat for a second, because both you and I are clearly Spielberg fans. I think both of us grew up probably watching so much of his stuff. And I came to you. I wasn't expecting for you to say Minority Report. I was totally giddy that you did, because it gave me an excuse to go back and watch this movie. I hadn't watched it in forever. So I want you to kind of talk about this film, what you love about this film, especially as you watch it as a historian of the police, or of New York police, or of the police state. What do you love about this film?
Yeah, I love about this film is I think, like I said, I think it really defies that police as scientist Sherlock Holmes archetype. Like, I think there are so many movies, TV shows about, we're not like normal cops, we're scientists, and we solve crimes with science, and like that's a more benign way of doing policing, is because we're scientists. And I think this really gets at something that is so troubling about policing that I think we have to really grapple with, which is how science legitimizes a policing that is incredibly flawed, incredibly racist, and ineffective at providing safety to people. So there are two main arguments of this film. And one of them we talk about all the time, which is like, oh, this is the dystopic future of Minority Report is, do people have free will? Can they arrest somebody for about to do a crime if they're not going to do it? How sure are they that this person would actually have committed the crime? But the other major lesson of this film, which I think gets a lot less attention, but I think is really, really important, is science as a legitimizing discourse. The lesson of the film, if you watch till the end, is that Max von Sydow there, the ultimate spoiler alert, sorry, the ultimate bad guy of the film. It turns out that he had committed a murder, and he was able to use his knowledge of this supposedly unimpeachable system to hide the murder. And throughout the film, people describe it as utterly infallible, the system. And I think it goes to show that when you have a system that is supposedly beyond questioning, that you can't question the science. It is science. It is fact. Math is math. It opens up an entire, really, really dangerous system for abuse. Because if people know how to manipulate the system, they know it inside and out, they know how it works, they are able to hide abuse in a system which we have established as a society is beyond reproach, that it is beyond questioning, that is utterly infallible. And I think this is like, and this is why it took so many years for people to realize that, like, lie detector tests are bullshit. That all of these different things that we rely on as infallible ways of knowing who is guilty and who is not are actually incredibly fallible, and we have to be able to question it in order to ensure that there aren't just miscarriages of justice every single place we turn. And I think this is one of the unsung lessons of Minority Report, is that science is never infallible. When you create systems that are supposedly beyond questioning, it is ripe for abuse.
Oh, God, I love that. I kept thinking about the judgment scenes, about how quickly these guys are judged, and things like, we've seen this in other films, certainly. This time cop scenes when these guys get judged. I know that you've probably seen that. These hats they put on, are these lobotomization hats? What is going on? Do we know for certain?
I have no idea what those are. They don't really articulate. It seems like it like disconnects your brain from your body. Like who knows? It immobilizes a person. Or
Yeah, I felt like in that moment, with that very first arrest they make, where the guy gets his glasses. And by the way, spoiler alerts don't exist when the film was 22 years old. This
Wow,
film could be graduating college right now. So if you have. People are coming in. I'm like, spoiler alert: Tom Cruise is the good guy.
The tech is amazing. Like I was like, it had been a little while since I had watched it as well, and I think I gasped at the scene where there's the iris scanning for advertising. I mean, this is surveillance capitalism at its finest, where they're targeting him with ads after reading his eyes, and then when he gets on the metro and it scans him to get in, the police get an instantaneous alert, and that's how they find him. The how entwined and centralized all this data collection is astoundingly accurate to the system that's been created now, where when I was at Whole Foods this week, you can now pay with your palm. I mean, it's biometric surveillance capitalism entwined with police surveillance ad infinitum.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if we could look at this film as an artifact. This film comes out in 2002. Obviously, it's taking Philip K. Dick's short story, but if we see these reflections of a fear, is it the reflections of anxiety over what the internet is growing and going to become in 2002? 2002, people are starting by this point in time have got the internet, I think, in their homes at this point in time. We're probably moving towards high-speed cable at that point in time. Like, there seems to be a real concern, because God forbid they look at my search history, like what people are going to buy, I'm watching this. God, this seems prescient as hell.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of in Sarah Igo's great book, The Known Citizen: The History of Privacy in America. Like, people were terrified when phones were in their home because you could connect to other people in the world, and it just sat there on your desk, and it's like it brought the world to you and you to the world. Like, you never know who would be listening. You didn't know, it brought up this kind of privacy panic that the internet did, I'm sure, as well. And it sounds like Minority Report, if it wasn't just an anxiety story about increasing technology and internet, definitely I would read it as a object of post 9/11 popular culture as well, and grappling with the re-rise of the surveillance state in the wake of 9/11.
A key point of this film I kept thinking as we were talking was Anderton's relationship to the criminal underground. He is clearly an addict who is recovering from the loss of his child, which is one of the really, I'm a parent, that kind of stuff is always difficult for me to watch, right? And I'm kind of wondering if that comes up in your research as well. Do these police officers, do they have relationships, or are they, do they have their own addictions and vices that they're coming across as well? Whenever you're talking about police, say, in the early 20th century.
Oh yeah. I mean, I remember a really pivotal moment in the 1850s. This is going back quite a ways. There was a resolution before the police board, which tried to disallow the NYPD from participating in the Fugitive Slave Act. It was a proposal that would have allowed NYPD officers to refuse to return escaped people back to their former owners, enslavers in the South. And it didn't pass. But what did pass at that same meeting was a resolution that forbid officers from being drunk in uniform. and so the relationship between police officers and getting drunk on the job and being intoxicated and participating in vice is as old as policing itself. Theodore Roosevelt used to do this thing that made him a terror to all the rank and file officers, where walking home from some, like gentlemen's, aristocratic membership club at night, very late at night, he would walk around and he would sneak up on officers who might be drunk or asleep on their beats and like frighten them and scare them. And so, yeah, I mean, the relationship between police and getting drunk and high and participating in vice. And I mean, this isn't even to mention the investigator participant of police who are supposedly investigating homosexuality or prostitution, who very much participate in it as a part of their investigation. So yeah, I mean that's a tale as old as time.
Are there parts of this movie that drive you nuts?
Yes, I think I never quite understand how arch and sinister the motives are at Colin Farrell in this movie. Like he comes in like he's going to be the big bad guy in this film, and it turns out he just wants the Department of Justice and the federal government to absorb pre-crime. You know, like they present him as being such like an arch terror in the first third of this movie, in a way that I am still kind of baffled by why his motives are to come in as aggressively as he did. And also a lot of the very unnecessary to me gross out scenes in the eye transplant, which, to be fair, tremendously cool. To live in a total surveillance world and to envision a world of resistance that involves like underground doctors who will replace your eyes for you for enough money. Like that is to think about the evolution of not just surveillance but resistance to surveillance. That's pretty That's pretty fascinating to me. But then to have him have like a runny nose and like wiping his hand on his nose and then performing surgery and then have him crawl to the fridge where he eats a rotten sandwich. Like, I get it. This is surgery not under ideal conditions. It's unnecessary to like do like 4 or 5 gross out gags in the span of like 5 minutes.
Yeah, I felt like the movie was uneven. There were parts that were certainly like there was humor in there that wasn't really, obviously you've got to, lighten up the film at some point in time, but some of the jokes don't quite hit. I remember though, going back, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this was the movie that they were going to set Colin Farrell up to be the next big thing, which was what I kept thinking. It's like, oh, here's the next Cruise. And for a while there was this push to make Farrell this guy, which I don't think he ever quite became. I think Farrell is another one of these character actors. Yeah,
he had like SWAT and The Recruit. Like he had a string of kind of like action-y thrillers in those aught years where it really felt like they were trying to make him, like the next kind of Tom Cruise.
The Recruit was definitely the thing, right? And I thought that was maybe the curve, right? Where it's like, oh, he's going to be the foil to Cruise, and then he gets killed, early in the third act.
Yeah.
And spoiler. You know what I actually dig him is actually, and this is a good transition to like some other films about police. I actually like Farrell in Michael Mann's Miami Vice film.
Yeah, I only just watched that recently on a plane.
What were your thoughts?
I was on a plane, so I was half paying attention. I think it was a red eye, so I might have been half asleep the whole time.
Michael Mann's probably my favorite director. I'm actually currently reading through Heat 2, the book, right now, in anticipation of the film that's coming out.
I've never seen Heat, actually. Netflix keeps trying to push it on me, but
oh gosh, you've for the next 3 hours, sir. You got to sit down. But here's my question. We talk about Minority Report. You're writing this book about police. What are your 2-3 favorite cop movies?
See, I like what they call like meeting movies. I like movies that are like a lot of people sitting in like meetings and talking. So I like investigation movies. I don't necessarily know if they are always transplant perfectly onto cop films. Like is Zodiac a police film? Mark Ruffalo plays a detective trying to solve, but it's mostly like a newspaper movie. So like I like Zodiac is probably one a big one for me. Like police movies. This is a difficult one. I mean, I like Mindhunter, the TV show, which is another kind of like we do policing with science sort of a movie. But I'm a Fincher head. So I was
going to say, are you going to tell me Seven is the next film? A lot,
Yeah. Oh, I didn't realize I chose 2 David Fincher movies back to back. I spent a lot of my childhood watching Blue Streak.
Oh wow!
With is it Martin Lawrence and Luke Wilson as a jewel thief who has to go undercover in the police department because that's where he hid a diamond from years earlier. Like, like I like buddy cop movies, like action comedies of the aughts. I guess
40. So I'm thinking the 80s. I'm thinking about 48 Hours, and I'm thinking Beverly Hills Kid. Pretty much anything with Eddie Murphy at this point in time.
But I'm not like a big like Training Day. Like I'm not like a big cop movie person. Like some of the I don't know, what are some of the other classics of that genre?
Serpico, I guess, think, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the big ones as far as the cop movies and stuff like that. All right, well, let me ask you this: what about the work? Because I kept thinking about Tyler Anbinder the whole time you're describing your book, and thinking about the Irish diaspora, immigration, things like that. Who are the scholars that really affected the development of your own work and the projects that you're thinking about moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think a huge impact on me was the kind of the whiteness studies field. So people like Matthew Fry Jacobson, the Thomas Guglielmo, Jennifer Guglielmo, David Roediger were really, really essential to me thinking about how policing made European immigrants, white. Policing as an engine of whiteness making, both for immigrants who joined the police force, but also for what they did on the street. Khalil Muhammad's Condemnation of Blackness was huge to this book, which kind of allowed me to conceptualize a type of police violence that happened in different neighborhoods, but for different purposes, like an inclusive violence of using police violence to train European people, immigrants, to become white and to become Americans, and exclusive violence, which sought to fully exclude African Americans from civic participation in New York. And then we get into some of kind of my more heady theoretical stuff. James Scott's Seeing Like a State was so central to thinking about police as the vanguard of state learning, of like how the state learns about people and what it does with that knowledge and how it organizes it once it's learned it. And Jonathan Finn's Capturing the Criminal Image, which is a history of kind of surveillance and technology and criminal justice from early mugshots and police files and fingerprints all the way through kind of face recognition today. And to that extent, also Simone Brown's book on surveillance of blackness, Dark Matters, is really essential to kind of building my historiographical and theoretical basis for this book.
See, now you're making my head spin, because now I really want to take your book and your work, and probably Emily's as well, and then ask how that affects the development of the carceral state in the United States. I mean, that's where my head is going right now.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this in the book. I mean, I think one, it's my book charts the development of the modern policing in the sense that we live in a time where policing is very information and surveillance based, where there is a chasm between the policed and the police, in the sense that like police don't feel the need to have good relations with communities, to be able to talk to them, to build trust, all of these things, because they can rely on fingerprints found at crime scenes. They can rely now on cameras, which have usurped the idea of needing witnesses or needing people in the community to talk to you. And to me, this question of how to police a multi-ethnic, multilingual city in the early 20th century, and we experimented with having people who can speak the language and know the culture, and that didn't really work out with us. So now let's rely on the science and technology. Let's rely on fingerprints. Let's rely on evidence. Later, let's rely on DNA evidence. All of these things is bridging that chasm, because police are disinterested, unable to have relationships with communities, going all the way back to the early 20th century. And so I really see this moment and the rise of these kind of surveillance technologies as being central to why the police kind of operate the way they do. But I also think, I talk about this in the introduction of the book, before police can lock up 1 million people, they have to know 1 million people. They need to be able to like organize and understand and have files on people. They need to, there is always a kind of bureaucratic and paperwork engine behind the physical exertions of state power. That's not to say that like every time a police goes out in the street and they club somebody and they hurt somebody and they shoot somebody or they pull someone over, there isn't like paperwork dictating that. But to have a system where you lock up 1 million people and you know where they are and you can transfer them and you can put them on parole and you can have a permanent police file and a parole file and it follows them forever. Like the larger landscape of the carceral state has as much to do with building the bureaucratic capacities of the government as it does building physical cells, I think.
Got it. See, now, I used to have the intro question of, do you drink Coke or Pepsi on this podcast? And of course, you're in Atlanta, so I'm going to assume that even if you're not actively drinking one, that you have to choose one over the other. But now I think the question is going to be, hi, Historian X, have you ever been arrested? And let's talk for the next 2 hours. We'll create our own administrative paperwork for that one.
I do live in Atlanta now, so I think I am probably legally required to say Colo. But I will say that I took in undergrad a history of the U.S. food industry class, which turned me off of soda forever. that between the actual operations of the companies and also the nutritional value of the, between all these different things coming together, I that class really kind of drove me away from soda forever.
All right, let's come back to this, Matt. Our big question here is Minority Report a history movie?
I mean, I've staked my career on the fact that, I think it is a history movie, in part because I think it is the distillation and the logical conclusion of a lot of intellectual traditions that begin in the late 19th and early 20th century. So in that sense, I think it absolutely is a history movie, because to understand where we got police that are trying to solve crime before they happen, and the long history of how they've attempted that and the harms that has done to communities in real life, I think one necessarily needs to look back at over 100 years of police history to understand that fully.
Dude, talking about your book and talking to you completely changed the way I watch Minority Report. Like this, and I have to tell you, that's my favorite thing about doing this thing, is like talking to somebody like yourself and like getting to think about this stuff and then seeing this thing that I know in this. It's like it's a completely different film for me. So that was just awesome. Where can people find you online, elsewhere? People want to reach out to you, learn more about the book, more about your work. Where can people find you?
Yeah, well, I'll say that the book is Police in the Empire City, Race and the Origins of Modern Policing in New York. It's out now from Duke University Press. You can find me on Twitter for now, or Blue Sky. You can go to MatthewGuariglia.com to see what I've been up to. And you can check out my day job, which is as a senior policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a membership-driven civil liberties nonprofit that focuses on technology policy.
Man, thank you so much for being here tonight. This was a blast. I was really looking forward to doing this.
This is fantastic. I can't wait to see it in the world.
And that's a wrap here at the HATM podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Matthew Guariglia, for coming in and talking to us about Minority Report and his work on police departments in New York City. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell, for being here every single week to produce this show and making this show possible for you guys. And of course, thank you to you guys for continuing to come in and listen to the show, for sharing it with your friends, sharing it on social media. That's how we're growing. That's how we're continuing to spread this message of what we've been doing for the last 6 years. And I could not do this without you. So thank you so much for being here. We've got a slew of great new pods coming for the rest of March and into April. Can't tell you just yet what else is coming, but it's coming and there's going to be a lot of it. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week. Ciao for now.